Chapter 1. The Architects of Green Thunder. There exists, in the shadowed margins of Warhammer's pre-imperial mythology, a race so thoroughly erased from existence that even their proper name dissolves into competing academic theories and fragmentary whispers. We call them the Brain Boyz, a designation that carries the weight of simultaneous reverence and dismissal, as if the universe itself cannot decide whether these entities deserve remembrance or deserve oblivion. They were, according to the most reliable, unreliable sources, the genetic architects who birthed the Orkoid species during the War in Heaven, that cosmic conflagration when gods walked between stars and entire realities buckled under the weight of their warfare. And then, at some unmarked moment in deep time, they vanished, completely. Without ceremony, without recorded catastrophe, without even the dignity of ruins substantial enough to prove they ever existed beyond theoretical necessity. This is their tragedy. This is their paradox. And this is why we must examine them, not because we can know them with certainty, but because their absence speaks volumes about the nature of creation, control, and the cosmic joke that even the most brilliant architects become victims of their own designs. Before we descend into the theoretical abyss of their disappearance, I need to ask you something. Where did you first encounter the Brain Boyz in Warhammer lore? Was it a codex footnote, a forum deep dive, an obscure novel reference? Drop a comment and tell me your entry point into this mystery. I'm genuinely curious how this forgotten race finds its scattered audience across the decades. Now, let us begin with what we think we know. The Brain Boyz emerged, or were created, or evolved. The texts remain frustratingly ambiguous. During the War in Heaven, that apocalyptic conflict between the Old Ones and the Cetan-empowered Necrontire that shattered the galaxy's metaphysical stability. The Old Ones, those cold-blooded cosmic gardeners who seeded life across the stars with the same casual indifference a human might plant seeds in spring, needed weapons. Not weapons in the conventional sense of guns or bombs, though those would come. They needed weapons that could think, weapons that could adapt. Weapons that could wage war across millennia without requiring constant oversight from their increasingly desperate creators. So they crafted the Brain Boyz. Think about that act of creation for a moment. The Old Ones, facing extinction at the hands of the Necrons' cold mathematics and the Ka'an's star-swallowing hunger, reached into the raw genetic clay of the universe and sculpted a race of beings whose sole purpose was intellectual warfare. Not soldiers, engineers, not fighters, designers. The Brain Boyz were meant to be the ultimate force multipliers, biological scientists with enhanced cognition who could rapidly iterate on weapons technology, genetic manipulation, and tactical innovation. They were given intelligence as their defining trait, problem-solving capacity, creative genius, and they delivered. Oh, how they delivered. The Brain Boyz created the Orks, or rather, they created the Krork, those massive, hyper-intelligent warforms that stood 3 to 4 meters tall and possessed technological sophistication that would make a modern Mechanicus Magos weep with envy. These were not the crude, accident-prone greenskins that infest the 41st millennium. These were living weapons of such terrifying effectiveness that they could stand toe-to-toe with Necron legions and emerge victorious. Each Krork could field advanced equipment, coordinate complex military operations, and adapt to battlefield conditions with frightening speed. They were self-replicating, their spores ensuring an endless supply of warriors. They were self-sustaining, their biology incorporating fungal and photosynthetic elements that meant they could survive in the harshest environments. They were, in every measurable way, a masterpiece of militant biological engineering. The Brain Boyz didn't stop there. They also created the Orkoid subspecies, the smaller, more specialized variants like Gretchen and Snotlings, each filling a necessary ecological and tactical niche within the greater greenskin war machine. They designed the Gestalt psychic field that would allow Orks to make their technology function through collective belief, a stroke of genius that meant even degraded future generations could maintain combat effectiveness without understanding the underlying science. They built into the genetic code an inherent understanding of mechanical engineering, weapons design, and tactical doctrine that would persist across countless generations. They created a perfect weapon, self-replicating, self-sustaining, self-improving through constant warfare, and therein lies the first paradox. The Brain Boyz, in their brilliance, designed a species that didn't need them. Every survival mechanism, every adaptive trait, every element of the Orkoid biology was engineered toward independence. The Krork didn't require constant supervision because their genetic memory contained all necessary knowledge. They didn't require external leadership because their social hierarchy emerged naturally from their size and combat prowess. They didn't require maintenance because the spore-based reproduction cycle ensured continuous regeneration of their forces. The Brain Boyz had created the perfect servants, so perfect that they rendered their creators obsolete. But let's examine a specific example from the fragmentary sources. The Ullanor campaign during the Great Crusade offers us a glimpse, however distorted by temporal distance, of what the Krork might have been at their height. The Ork empire that the Emperor faced on Ullanor was, by all accounts, a shadow of the War in Heaven era Krork civilization. Yet even this degraded form fielded millions of warriors, sophisticated void ships, and fortress complexes of staggering scale. The largest Ork war boss encountered measured somewhere between 5 and 10 meters tall, approaching but not matching the stature of the ancient Krork. His technology, while crude by Imperial standards, functioned with brutal effectiveness. Now imagine the original article. Imagine Krork, who stood even taller, whose technology wasn't crude but refined, whose tactical acumen wasn't instinctual but calculated. Imagine them led or advised by the Brain Boyz themselves, those hyper-intelligent beings who could iterate on designs in real time, who could analyze battlefield data and produce countermeasures within hours, who could perhaps even perceive and manipulate the warp with scientific precision that we've lost to history. The sources suggest that the Brain Boyz served as a caste of leaders or advisors within early Orkoid society. They were the thinkers behind the fighters. They directed the strategic deployment of Krork forces across the galaxy. They refined and improved the genetic templates, perhaps even creating specialized Krork variants for specific combat roles. They were, in essence, the officer class of the Old Ones' most successful military project. But here we encounter our second paradox, deeper and more troubling than the first. The Brain Boyz were intelligent, profoundly so. They possessed cognitive abilities that likely exceeded anything we can comprehend from our 41st millennium perspective. They could see patterns in chaos. They could predict outcomes across vast probabilistic matrices. They could understand the fundamental genetic and metaphysical principles that govern reality at levels we've forgotten exist. And yet, with all that intelligence, they apparently failed to predict or prevent their own extinction. Or did they? This is the question that haunts the deep lore. Did the Brain Boyz vanish because they failed to see their doom coming? Or did they see it coming with perfect clarity and find themselves powerless to prevent it anyway? Consider the philosophical weight of that distinction, the tragedy of ignorance versus the tragedy of helpless knowledge. Both are terrible, both are very human, despite the cosmic scales involved. We can find hints of this tension in the way Orkoid society evolved after the Brain Boyz vanished. The Orks lost access to higher reasoning but retained their fundamental effectiveness. They simplified, degraded, became less sophisticated, but they survived. They thrived, actually. They spread across the galaxy like a green tide that even the Imperium at its height cannot fully contain. Meanwhile, the brilliant architects who created them left no trace beyond the genetic legacy embedded in greenskin DNA. The servants outlived the masters. The weapons outlasted the wielders. What does that tell us about the nature of success? About the metrics by which we measure evolutionary fitness or intellectual achievement? The Brain Boyz might have been the smartest beings in the galaxy, but the Orks, those crude, violent, thoughtless, spore-born warriors, proved more adaptable to the post-War in Heaven reality. Intelligence, it seems, was not enough. Perhaps it was even a liability. We can trace this irony through the technological artifacts that Orks produce in the 41st millennium. Their weapons shouldn't work. By all rational principles of engineering and physics, a shooter held together with scrap metal and bolts shouldn't fire accurate shots. A truck built from random scavenged parts shouldn't achieve faster than light travel, even if we generously interpret travel to include their insane teleportation technology. Yet they do work, because the collective psychic field of the Orks makes them work. The Brain Boyz encoded this reality-bending capability into the species as a failsafe, a way for even degraded future generations to maintain combat effectiveness without understanding the underlying science. This is genius. Terrifying, beautiful genius. The Brain Boyz looked into the deep future and saw that their creations might lose access to higher reasoning. So they built a workaround. They weaponized belief itself. They made it so that an Ork's expectation of how something should work could override physical laws through the medium of the warp. It's perhaps the most sophisticated application of psychic engineering ever attempted, a gestalt field that functions automatically, requiring no conscious control or understanding from its users. But here's the third paradox, the one that cuts deepest. This same system, this reality-warping gestalt psychic field, might be why the Brain Boyz couldn't survive. Think about it. If you create a species whose collective consciousness can reshape reality according to their expectations, and that species vastly outnumbers you, and that species begins to develop their own cultural narratives about what's important and what's not, well, what happens to the beings who don't fit into those narratives? What happens when the Krork start seeing themselves as the primary actors in their own story, and the Brain Boyz as unnecessary supporting characters? Does the psychic field, in its blind democracy, begin to edit them out of reality? Does collective disbelief become a form of existential murder? We're speculating now, dancing along the edge of what can be known, but this is where the tragedy becomes cosmic. The Brain Boyz might have engineered their own extinction through their greatest triumph. They gave the Orks power over reality itself, and the Orks, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps inevitably, used that power to erase the uncomfortable truth that they had been designed rather than naturally evolved. Better to believe in spontaneous generation from spores, in the natural order of boss rules, everything, in the simple cosmology of Gork and Mork, than to acknowledge the debt owed to these strange, small-statured, big-headed creatures who claimed credit for greenskin existence. Children often reject their parents. Tools often outlive their makers. But for the rejection to happen at the level of fundamental reality, for the very existence of your creators to become metaphysically unsustainable because your species' collective unconscious prefers a simpler story, that's horror on a scale that transcends mere death. And yet we still haven't addressed the most basic question. When did they vanish? The sources give us nothing concrete. The war in heaven ended roughly 60 million years before the 41st millennium, though these numbers exist in that fuzzy space where precision becomes meaningless. The Necrons entered their great sleep. The old ones disappeared or died. The surviving younger races inherited a shattered galaxy. And somewhere in that vast transition, the Brain Boyz ceased to exist. Did they die immediately after the war ended, their purpose fulfilled, and their survival deemed unnecessary by whoever made such decisions? Did they linger for millennia, slowly declining as their Krork children needed them less and less? Did they try to adapt, to find new roles in the post-war galaxy, only to discover that they'd been too specialized, too narrowly designed for a specific purpose that no longer existed? We can find a parallel in the fate of the Slann, those powerful servants of the Old Ones who survived their master's fall, but found themselves increasingly isolated, increasingly irrelevant in a galaxy that had moved on without them. The Slann retreated into contemplation and slow decay. They became living fossils, technically immortal, but practically extinct. Their vast powers turned inward toward maintaining what little remains of the Old Ones' great plan. Could the Brain Boyz have followed a similar path? Could they be out there somewhere, in forgotten corners of the galaxy, slowly fading into cosmic senility as they realize that nothing they do matters anymore? That might be more tragic than simple extinction. To survive beyond your purpose, to watch your creations thrive while you wither. To possess all that intelligence and have nothing meaningful to apply it toward. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still in the space of establishing what we think we know about the Brain Boyz before we can properly theorize about their disappearance. And here's what we know with something approaching certainty. They were small. Physically unimpressive compared to the towering Krork. The sources describe them as having oversized heads, presumably to house their enhanced brains. They likely possessed fine motor control and manual dexterity, necessary for their genetic engineering work. They may have had psychic abilities, though the texts remain unclear on this point. They were organic beings, not mechanical constructs like their enemies, the Necrons. And they were created or uplifted by the Old Ones, which means they carried the philosophical burden of being second-generation designers, themselves designed to be designers. Think about that burden. The Brain Boyz were, in a sense, living reminders of intelligent design as a cosmological principle. They knew with absolute certainty that they had been made. They knew who made them. They knew why they were made. And then they turned around and replicated that act upon the Orkoids, creating beings who would never know or understand their origins with the same clarity. Was there guilt in that? Did the Brain Boyz, in their moments of contemplation between battles, wonder about the ethics of their work? Did they see themselves as perpetuating a cycle of cosmic manipulation, or did they embrace their role as necessary intermediaries between divine creators and brute instruments? The sources don't tell us. They can't tell us. The Brain Boyz left no philosophical treatises, no recorded debates, no monuments to their internal struggles. They left only the Orks, and the Orks don't philosophize. They fight, they build, they propagate. They laugh at the absurdity of existence and then hit it with a chopper until it stops bothering them. The Brain Boyz gifted their creations with simplicity, with purpose uncluttered by existential doubt, and perhaps that was the kindest thing they could have done. But let's examine one more specific example before we transition to deeper analysis. The concept of the Smart Boys, those rare Ork mech boys and pain boys who display unusual intelligence and curiosity, who sometimes stumble onto innovations that seem beyond typical green-skin cognition. Could these be genetic throwbacks? Could the Brain Boyz' DNA, dormant but not destroyed, occasionally express itself in modern Orks? The canon remains ambiguous, but the possibility is tantalizing. Imagine being a smart boy, possessed of genuine intelligence in a culture that values brutality and simplicity, understanding things your fellows cannot comprehend, seeing patterns they cannot perceive, and being utterly unable to communicate these insights in any way that matters because the Gestalt field of Orkoid consciousness simply doesn't accommodate that kind of thinking. You would be alone, utterly alone, despite being surrounded by millions of your kind. You would possess a fragment of the Brain Boy's intellectual legacy and find it to be a curse rather than a gift, because you exist in a society that has evolved past the need for your kind of thinking. This is the fourth paradox, the one that hurts most. If the Brain Boyz do survive, even as genetic echoes, they survive only as strangers in the world they created. Their greatest success becomes their ultimate isolation. And this brings us to the threshold of our deeper inquiry. We've established who the Brain Boyz were, what they created, and the fundamental paradoxes inherent in their existence. We've seen how intelligence can be both weapon and weakness, how creation can be both legacy and obliteration. But we haven't yet confronted the central mystery, the actual mechanism and meaning of their disappearance. That requires us to examine the theories, the evidence, the competing narratives that scholars and enthusiasts have constructed over decades of engagement with these fragmentary sources. What really happened to the Brain Boyz? Was it catastrophe or choice? Murder or suicide? Evolution or devolution? The answers, such as they are, wait in the darkness ahead, and they will not comfort us. But perhaps that's as it should be. The Brain Boyz created weapons after all. Chapter 2. The Theories of Absence. Every extinction event leaves traces, fossils, ruins, genetic markers, cultural memories, the cosmic background radiation of civilization, fading but detectable for those willing to look carefully enough at the static between stars. The Brain Boyz left almost nothing. This absence itself becomes the primary evidence we must interrogate, turning the investigation into a strange exercise in negative space. A detective story where the crime scene has been so thoroughly erased that we must deduce the nature of the crime from the very quality of that erasure. So let us examine the theories. Multiple. Competing. None fully satisfying because satisfaction would require evidence that doesn't exist. But each theory tells us something important, not just about the Brain Boyz, but about how we construct narratives around loss, how we assign meaning to disappearance, how we cope with the uncomfortable possibility that even the most brilliant beings can simply stop. The first major theory, let's call it the obsolescence theory, posits that the Brain Boyz engineered themselves into irrelevance. According to this interpretation, they succeeded too well. The Krork became so effective, so self-sufficient, that maintaining a separate leadership caste became energetically and evolutionarily wasteful. Natural selection, that blind optimizing force, favors efficiency. A biological system that can eliminate redundant components without losing functionality will do so, given enough time and pressure. Perhaps the Brain Boyz simply fell victim to this mathematical truth. Their intelligence was necessary during the War in Heaven, when rapid innovation and tactical adaptation meant the difference between victory and extinction. But after the war? After the immediate threat passed and the galaxy settled into its current configuration of endless low-intensity conflict, that level of intelligence became a luxury the Orkoid system couldn't afford to maintain. Consider the energetic cost of maintaining a large brain. Human neurons, for comparison, consume approximately 20% of the body's total energy budget, despite representing only 2% of body mass. Now extrapolate that to beings with even larger, more sophisticated brains, the Brain Boyz, with their oversized heads and enhanced cognitive abilities. They would have required massive caloric intake, protection from physical threats due to their relative fragility, and social structures that valued intellectual contribution over physical prowess. All of this runs counter to the basic Orkoid logic of bigger is better and fight is right. The Krorks bash skulls and win. The Brain Boyz could think and plan. One of these skill sets is immediately valuable in any given moment. The other requires social infrastructure to recognize and reward its contributions. In evolutionary terms, the Brain Boyz might have occupied an unstable niche. They were necessary for design, but not for operation, necessary for innovation, but not for replication. And the Orkoid genetic system, with its spore-based reproduction and encoded instinctual knowledge, meant that innovation could be baked into the DNA and then simply repeated forever, without needing active intelligence to maintain it. The Krork inherited technological and tactical knowledge the same way humans inherit instincts, automatically, without conscious learning. So why keep the designers around once the design was finished? This theory has a terrible elegance to it. It suggests that the Brain Boyz weren't murdered or destroyed, they were selected against. Generation by generation, their population dwindled as resources flowed toward the Krork who could actually fight and reproduce effectively. Perhaps the Brain Boyz themselves recognized this. Perhaps they saw the demographic trends and understood that they'd build themselves into an evolutionary dead end. Perhaps the last Brain Boyz died knowing that their extinction was the final proof of their success. Their creations no longer needed them, which meant they'd done their job perfectly. Can you imagine that knowledge? Can you imagine being the last of your kind and understanding, with perfect intellectual clarity, that your obsolescence was inevitable and even desirable from the perspective of the system you helped create? That's not tragedy in the dramatic sense. That's tragedy in the thermodynamic sense. The cold mathematics of energy distribution and reproductive success, grinding away until you simply aren't efficient enough to justify your continued existence. But the obsolescence theory has problems. It assumes gradual decline, but the sources suggest the Brain Boyz vanished relatively quickly, certainly within a time frame measured in thousands rather than millions of years. It also doesn't explain why there are no ruins, no remains, no archaeological evidence whatsoever. Even species that go extinct naturally leave traces. The Brain Boyz left nothing, as if they were erased rather than simply fading away. So let's consider the second major theory, the psychic catastrophe theory. This interpretation focuses on the Gestalt psychic field that the Brain Boyz engineered into the Orkoid species. As we discussed before, this field allows Orks to manipulate reality according to their collective expectations. It's a sophisticated system, perhaps the most sophisticated psychic engineering ever attempted. But sophisticated systems have failure modes. Complex mechanisms can break in ways that simple ones cannot. What if the Gestalt field wasn't as stable as the Brain Boyz believed? What if there were feedback loops, resonance effects, cascade failures that only became apparent once the Orkoid population reached a certain critical mass? During the War in Heaven, with the Old Ones presumably. Maintaining oversight and the Brain Boyz actively monitoring their creation's development, any such problems could have been corrected. But after the war, after the Old Ones vanished and the Brain Boyz were left to manage billions or trillions of increasingly independent Krork, the theory suggests that the psychic field turned on its creators. Not through malice. The Orks lack the capacity for that kind of sophisticated hatred, but through simple demographic weight. As the Krork population exploded across the galaxy, their collective psychic presence grew exponentially. They began to reshape reality according to their cultural expectations and biological imperatives. And those expectations, those imperatives, had no place for small, weak, smart creatures who didn't fight and couldn't reproduce two spores. The Krork saw themselves as the natural order. They saw the cosmos as a place where the strong ruled and the weak perished. They saw their own existence as self-evident and self-justifying, requiring no external explanation or validation. And the Gestalt field, being democratic in the worst sense, began to enforce that worldview. Reality itself started to conform to what billions of Krork believed should be true. And what they believed increasingly was that the Brain Boyz didn't exist. Or didn't matter. or had never been important in the first place. The field eroded the Brain Boyz' existence, not through active destruction, but through passive rejection. The same way a social group can make someone effectively invisible simply by collectively agreeing not to acknowledge them. This is existential horror refined to its purest form. To be unmade not by violence but by disbelief. To watch yourself fade from reality as the cosmos itself forgets you exist. The Brain Boyz would have understood what was happening. They designed the system after all. They knew how the Gestalt field worked. They could probably measure their own declining psychic coherence, watch the probability of their continued existence drop day by day, calculate with horrible precision the moment when they would cross some threshold of collective disbelief and simply cease to be in any meaningful sense. Could they have fought it? Could they have used their intelligence to find some countermeasure, some way to anchor themselves in reality despite the Gestalt field's rejection? The theory suggests they tried. That their complete disappearance represents not a sudden catastrophe, but a long, desperate battle against their own creation. A battle they ultimately lost because they'd made the Gestalt field too powerful, too fundamental to Orkoid existence to simply be turned off or modified. They'd built a perfect cage and handed the keys to beings who would never understand they were imprisoners. But even this theory has gaps. It requires the Krork to have developed a unified cultural narrative that excluded the Brain Boyz. And the sources suggest Orkoid culture was already fragmenting into rival warbands and competing boss-led factions. Would such a divided population generate a strong enough consensus to warp reality in such a specific way? And wouldn't the Brain Boyz themselves, as psychically active beings, contribute to the Gestalt field in a way that might preserve their own existence? Unless they realized what was happening and chose not to fight it. Unless they saw that resisting the Gestalt field would mean weakening it, and weakening it would make their Krork creations less effective, less capable of surviving in the post-War in Heaven galaxy. Unless they chose extinction over compromising their greatest creation. That would be consistent with their role as designers, as beings whose entire purpose was serving the greater strategic goal of defeating the Necrons. If preserving themselves meant damaging the weapon they'd been created to build, then self-sacrifice wouldn't just be honorable, it would be literally definitional. They would cease to be what they were if they prioritized their own survival over the effectiveness of their designs. And here we encounter the fifth paradox, more subtle than the others, but no less profound. The Brain Boyz were intelligent enough to recognize moral dilemmas, but were created for a specific purpose that might override moral reasoning. They could see that sacrificing themselves was necessary for the greater good, but they could also see that greater good was itself a constructed concept imposed by their creators, the Old Ones. Were they truly making a choice if they'd been designed to make that choice? Is sacrifice meaningful if you were built to find it meaningful? These are questions without answers. Or rather, they're questions where every answer generates 10 new questions, recursing into infinite philosophical regress. The Brain Boyz might have been trapped not just by external forces, but by the internal logic of their own existence, caught between intelligence that could question everything and purpose that demanded they question nothing. Let's examine our third major theory, the Old Ones Betrayal theory. This interpretation takes a darker view of the power dynamics involved. It suggests that the Brain Boyz didn't vanish due to obsolescence or psychic catastrophe, but were actively eliminated by their creators. The logic goes like this: the Old Ones were losing the war in Heaven. Desperate, they created increasingly powerful weapons. The Eldar, the Krork, various other younger races we know even less about. But powerful weapons are dangerous. They can turn on their makers. The Old Ones, despite or perhaps because of their vast intellect, understood this risk, so they built in failsafes. The Brain Boyz, according to this theory, were one such failsafe, but also a potential threat. They possessed the knowledge to modify Orkoid genetics, which meant they could theoretically create new variants, new subspecies, new combinations that might serve purposes beyond what the Old Ones intended. They were intermediaries, yes, but intermediaries with agency. And agency is always dangerous when you're trying to maintain absolute control over weapons of cosmic significance. So the Old Ones, either during the final phases of the war or in its immediate aftermath, activated some kind of genetic kill switch, or psychic command, or quantum entanglement that unraveled the Brain Boyz' existence across all possible timelines simultaneously. The complete absence of remains, of ruins, of any archaeological trace becomes evidence for this theory. It suggests deliberate erasure, thorough and systematic, carried out by beings who understood reality at fundamental levels we can't access. The Old Ones didn't just kill the Brain Boyz, they unmade them, reached back through time and edited them out of history itself, leaving only the functional components, the Krork, while eliminating the design team that might have proven problematic in future ages. This is perhaps the most chilling theory because it strips the Brain Boyz of agency entirely. They weren't victims of their own success or their own creation. They were simply discarded tools, used and disposed of with the same clinical efficiency that the Old Ones presumably applied to all their cosmic guarding projects. There was no choice, no struggle, no final stand, just existence and then non-existence, and the universe moving on without noticing the transition. The Brain Boyz would have been aware of this possibility. How could they not be, given their intelligence? They would have known that their creators might see them as threats. They would have lived with that knowledge every day, understanding that their continued existence depended entirely on remaining useful and non-threatening in ways they couldn't fully control. That's a special kind of existential dread. To know that you're valuable only so long as your value exceeds your threat potential, and to know that the equation might shift without warning based on calculations you can't perceive by beings whose motivations you can't fully comprehend. The Brain Boyz were, in this interpretation, slaves who happened to have large brains. Their intelligence made them better slaves, more useful, more capable of complex tasks, but didn't free them from slavery. It might have even made the slavery worse, because they understood their position with perfect clarity. And yet this theory also has problems. It requires us to believe that the Old Ones, despite being apparently on the verge of extinction, had enough control and power to execute a galaxy-wide erasure operation. It requires us to accept that beings we've been told were enlightened, cosmic gardeners, were actually ruthless, utilitarian calculators willing to commit genocide against their own creations. It requires a level of paranoia and cruelty that seems inconsistent with other aspects of the Old Ones' characterization in the lore. Unless that characterization is itself propaganda, stories the Eldar tell themselves about their beloved creators to avoid confronting the possibility that they, too, were just weapons that happen to remain. Useful longer than the Brain Boyz. The sources don't give us enough information to choose between these theories with confidence. Each has evidence in its favor. Each has gaps and problems. Each requires us to make assumptions about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, free will, and cosmic power structures. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the ambiguity is the lesson. The Brain Boyz vanished in ways we can't fully explain, despite deploying our considerable analytical tools and reconstructive methods. They were smart enough to design self-replicating weapons that would outlive their species by tens of millions of years, but not smart enough, or not powerful enough to prevent their own extinction. What does that tell us about the limits of intelligence, about the difference between knowing and controlling, about the gap between understanding a system and being able to manipulate it to your benefit? These questions have modern relevance, don't they? We live in an age of increasing intellectual sophistication, of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and technologies that reshape the human experience in fundamental ways. We tell ourselves that being smart enough to create these tools means we're smart enough to control them. The Brain Boyz probably told themselves the same thing. They were wrong, or they were right, depending on how you define control. The Orks are, by any objective measure, extraordinarily successful. They've survived for 60 million years. They're present on almost every inhabited world in the galaxy. They cannot be permanently defeated because their spore reproduction means that even total extermination of visible Orks just plants the seeds for future infestations. In that sense, the Brain Boyz achieved immortality through their creations. They just didn't achieve it for themselves. There's a philosophical distinction here worth exploring. The difference between creating something that outlives you and creating something that preserves you. The difference between legacy and survival. The Brain Boyz clearly achieved the former. Their designs worked exactly as intended, even 60 million years later. But they failed at the latter, if indeed they even tried. Maybe they didn't care about survival. Maybe they were designed not to care. Maybe caring about your own continued existence was a luxury their creators couldn't afford to give them, because beings who cared more about themselves than their purpose might prove unreliable when the galaxy was burning and every decision could mean the difference between survival and extinction. We can trace this tension through the few sources that mention the Brain Boyz by name. They're always described in terms of function, never personality, always defined by what they did, never who they were. It's as if the lore itself has absorbed the Old Ones' perspective, treating the Brain Boyz as tools rather than beings, as means rather than ends. And perhaps that absorption is itself a form of their continued erasure, a way that even we, trying to remember and honor them, participate in their reduction to pure utility. This brings us back to our original question, the one that started this entire investigation. Why do we care about the Brain Boyz? Why does this obscure race, mentioned only in footnotes and deep lore discussions, deserve this level of analysis? The obvious answer is that they created the Orks, and the Orks are important to the setting. But I think there's something deeper. I think the Brain Boyz represent something we recognize and fear, the possibility that intelligence isn't enough, that understanding your fate doesn't give you power to change it, that being brilliant and thoughtful and creative doesn't protect you from becoming obsolete, forgotten, erased. In a universe that often celebrates the triumph of intelligence over brute force, the Brain Boyz stand as a counterexample. They were smart, they still lost, and maybe that's why the lore keeps them obscure. Maybe acknowledging them too directly would undermine the power fantasy that Warhammer 40K often indulges. The fantasy that being the smartest person in the room gives you control, that understanding the game means you can win it. The Brain Boyz understood the game perfectly. They still got removed from the board. There's no twist where they secretly survived. No reveal where we discover they ascended to higher dimensions or uploaded themselves into the Ork genetic code or any other science fiction escape hatch. They just ended, completely. Without dignity or ceremony or final speeches about the meaning of their existence, that absence of narrative closure is itself significant. It denies us the comfort of a proper ending, the satisfaction of seeing their story resolved in some meaningful way. Instead, we're left with questions and theories, with competing interpretations and insufficient evidence. We're left in the same position as the Brain Boyz themselves, possessing intelligence enough to ask the right questions, but lacking the power to definitively answer them. The text makes us complicit in their tragedy by forcing us to reconstruct and reinterpret and argue about what happened, all while knowing that the truth, whatever it is, remains. Forever inaccessible behind walls of lost time and deliberately erased history. So where does this leave us? We've examined three major theories: obsolescence, psychic catastrophe, and Old Ones Betrayal, and found all of them partially compelling and partially inadequate. We've traced the paradoxes and ironies embedded in the Brain Boyz' existence and extinction. We've confronted uncomfortable questions about intelligence, purpose, and survival. But we still don't have closure. We still don't have certainty. And perhaps, as we turn toward our final chapter, we need to ask whether certainty is even possible, whether the Brain Boyz' disappearance might be one of those historical events that simply cannot be known, only interpreted. Whether their absence teaches us more than their presence ever could. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. There's one more angle we need to explore, one more layer to peel back. Because if we're going to truly understand the tragedy of the Brain Boyz, we need to look at what they left behind, not just the Orks, but the conceptual and philosophical legacy of their existence. We need to examine how their absence shapes the modern 40K setting, how the gaps they left create pressures and possibilities that influence events 60 million years after they vanished. Their disappearance wasn't just an ending, it was also a beginning. And that transformation from beings to void, from presence to absence, from concrete existence to theoretical speculation, might be the most Brain Boy-like thing about their entire story. They created a weapon that changed the galaxy forever. Then they stepped back, or were pushed back, or chose to fall back, into the darkness from which no coherent narrative can rescue them. That takes a special kind of brilliance, or a special kind of despair. Possibly both. Chapter 3, The Silence That Remains. When a race vanishes, the void they leave doesn't remain empty. Nature, they say, abhors a vacuum, and so does history. Something rushes in to fill the absence, to explain it, to paper over the gap with narratives that make sense to the survivors. In the case of the Brain Boyz, what rushed in was mythology, or more precisely, the conspicuous lack of mythology. The Orks, those inheritors of the Brain Boyz' greatest work, developed no creation myths about their designers, no prayers, no monuments, no cultural memory whatsoever of the beings who literally sculpted their genetics and shaped their destiny. This is remarkable when you think about it. Humans create gods from far less. We take natural phenomena we don't understand and personify them. We construct elaborate theological systems to explain our origins, our purpose, the shape of our moral universe. We tell stories about where we came from, because the alternative, believing we're random accidents with no deeper meaning, is psychologically intolerable for most people. But the Orks, they seem perfectly content with spontaneous generation from fungal spores. They see themselves as self-evident facts of nature rather than designed artifacts. And this contentment, this absolute lack of curiosity about their own origins, might be the most devastating proof of the Brain Boyz' complete erasure. Because it suggests that the Brain Boyz didn't just die, they were forgotten so thoroughly that forgetting became baked into Orkoid psychology. Modern Orks don't wonder where they came from. It doesn't occur to them to wonder. They fight, they build, they reproduce through spores, and these activities are their own justification. Purpose without origin, existence without explanation. It's almost Zen-like in its simplicity, except the Zen requires conscious choice to embrace simplicity, while the Orks have simplicity thrust upon them by their genetic programming. Or do they? That's the troubling question we need to interrogate. Did the Brain Boyz deliberately engineer this incuriosity into their creations? It would make sense from a practical standpoint. A species that constantly questioned its own origins and purpose might be less effective as a weapon. Philosophical doubt introduces hesitation, and hesitation gets you killed on the battlefield. Better to create beings who simply are, who exist in an eternal present of violent action without troubling themselves about past or future beyond immediate tactical considerations. This would be consistent with everything else we know about the Brain Boyz' design philosophy. They built for function, for effectiveness, for survival in the harshest imaginable conditions. Existential introspection doesn't contribute to those goals. It might actively undermine them, but consider the alternative possibility. Maybe the Orks' lack of creation mythology isn't engineered, it's learned, or more precisely, it's the result of the psychic gestalt field we keep returning to, like a wound we can't stop probing. If that field allows collective belief to shape reality, then collective disbelief could unmake it. And what's more fundamentally threatening to the Orkish worldview than the possibility that they were designed? That they're tools rather than naturally evolved warriors? That their entire existence serves someone else's purposes rather than being inherently meaningful? A human might struggle with that knowledge, but ultimately accommodate it into their belief system. A human has the cognitive flexibility to hold contradictory ideas, to believe both that we're shaped by evolutionary forces beyond our control and that we possess meaningful agency in how we live our lives. But the Orks, with their more simplified, though not simple, there's an important distinction: psychology might find such contradictions literally unsustainable. The cognitive dissonance might be so severe that the Gestalt field simply rejects the information entirely, not through conscious decision but through something closer to an immune response. The truth about their origins becomes a psychic pathogen, and the collective Orkish consciousness develops antibodies which manifest as complete inability to conceive of or remember their designers. This would mean the Brain Boyz' erasure from Orkoid memory happened not because they were deliberately forgotten, but because they couldn't be remembered without destabilizing the entire psychic cultural ecosystem the Orks had developed. They became a blind spot, a cognitive void, an area of thought space that the Orkish mind simply skates past without noticing the gap. And if that's true, if the Brain Boyz' absence from Orkoid culture is maintained by active psychic processes operating at the species level, then any individual Ork who did somehow learn the truth would find that knowledge unbearable. Literally. The Gestalt field would reject it, and by extension, reject them. They would become anomalies, glitches, beings whose thoughts don't align with the collective reality their species has constructed. There might be Orks like this, weird boys who've touched something in the warp. Mech boys whose innovations brought them too close to understanding the underlying principles of their own technology. They would be the most tragic figures in all of Orkdom, beings who glimpsed the truth about their created nature and found themselves isolated by that knowledge, unable to share it because sharing would be tantamount to species-level heresy. They would understand, in however fragmentary a way, that they are weapons, that their entire culture, their entire existence, serves purposes that were defined before they ever lived, and they would be completely powerless to change or even communicate that reality. This is the sixth paradox, and it cuts deeper than all the others. The Brain Boyz created the most successful weapons in galactic history, so successful that those weapons cannot acknowledge their creator's existence without risking their own psychological stability. The perfect slave race doesn't remember being enslaved. The perfect weapon doesn't recognize itself as a weapon. freedom through enforced ignorance, liberation through mandatory forgetting. The Brain Boyz gave the Orks everything except self-knowledge, and that omission might be the kindest or cruelest thing they could have done, depending on how you value consciousness versus contentment. But let's shift our focus from the Orks to the other inhabitants of the 40K universe. How do they understand the Brain Boyz? What do the Imperium scholars know? What do the Eldar remember? What about the Necrons who actually fought against the Krork during the War in Heaven and would have encountered the Brain Boyz directly? Here the sources become even more fragmentary, more frustrating in their incompleteness. But what little we can glean is instructive. The Imperium by and large doesn't know the Brain Boyz ever existed. Their records of the War in Heaven are spotty at best, corrupted by millennia of degraded data storage and deliberate purging of pre-Imperial history. The Mechanicus might have fragments, ancient texts that reference the first designers or the keepers of the Green Genesis, but these would be buried in archives so deep and restricted that even most tech priests never encounter them. And if they did, they would likely dismiss such references as apocrypha, myths from less enlightened ages, before the Omnissiah revealed proper technological understanding. The Imperium's epistemology doesn't accommodate beings like the Brain Boyz. They were organic intellects rather than machine spirits. They served purposes that predate the Emperor's plan for humanity. They represent a model of creation that conflicts with the Mechanicus' beliefs about how technology should develop and be understood. So the Brain Boyz remain unknown, edited out of Imperial history not through conspiracy, but through simple institutional indifference. They don't fit into the Imperium's narratives about how the galaxy works. They complicate the story. Better to ignore them, to pretend they never existed, to let the Orks be simple alien threats without troubling context or uncomfortable origin stories. This is erasure through bureaucratic neglect, not malicious, just supremely uncaring. The Brain Boyz matter so little to the Imperium that even learning about them wouldn't change anything. They're dead after all. Gone for millions of years. What would be the point of remembering? The Eldar, though, they should remember. They were created by the Old Ones around the same time as the Krork. They fought alongside the Brain Boyz creations during the War in Heaven. Their cultural memory extends back into that era with far more clarity than any other surviving race. And yet the sources suggest that even Eldar knowledge of the Brain Boyz is vague, uncertain, more theoretical reconstruction than direct memory. Why? Several possibilities present themselves. First, the Eldar might be protecting the Brain Boyz secret, or rather, protecting the Orks from the destabilizing knowledge of their origins. The Eldar understand psychic dynamics far better than humans. If they've concluded that revealing the truth about the Brain Boyz to the Orks would cause some kind of catastrophic psychic event, they might choose silence as the lesser evil. This would be consistent with the Eldar's typical approach to problems: manipulative, operating through strategic omission and misdirection, willing to sacrifice transparency for stability. They've watched the Orks for 60 million years. They've seen how the greenskin civilization functions. Maybe they recognize that the system works precisely because the Orks don't question it, and questioning would introduce failure modes that could make the Orks even more dangerous than they already are. Second, the Eldar might simply not care. Their relationship with the Brain Boyz was presumably minimal. They were concurrent projects of the Old Ones, not collaborators. The Eldar had their own struggles, their own purposes, their own trajectory away from simple weapons toward the sophisticated and ultimately doomed civilization that would birth Slaanesh. From their perspective, the Brain Boyz were just another tool in the Old Ones' workshop, briefly useful and then discarded when obsolete. Why waste mental energy remembering them? The Eldar's capacity for memory is vast but not infinite. They choose what to preserve and what to let fade. The Brain Boyz, having left no lasting cultural artifacts or philosophical contributions, might simply not rate preservation in the Eldar consciousness. Third, and this is the most disturbing possibility, the Eldar might have been complicit in the Brain Boyz' erasure, not actively perhaps, but passively, through indifference, through failure to intervene when they saw what was happening. The Eldar survived the War in Heaven. They watched the Old Ones disappear. They witnessed the transformation of the galaxy from a place of cosmic order to the chaos and horror of the current age. And somewhere in that transformation, the Brain Boyz vanished. Did the Eldar notice? Did they care? Or were they too busy with their own survival, their own grief over losing their creators, to spare concern for another of the Old Ones projects? This would make the Eldar witnesses to genocide, or extinction, or erasure, depending on which theory you believe, but witnesses who chose to look away, who decided that one more tragedy in a galaxy full of tragedies wasn't worth their attention, and maybe we can't blame them. Maybe in the scale of suffering they witnessed during and after the war in heaven, the quiet disappearance of one relatively small race barely registered. But that utilitarian calculation, that cold triage of which extinctions merit grief and which don't, makes them complicit nonetheless. They could have remembered. Or they chose not to share what they remembered, which amounts to the same thing for those of us trying to reconstruct this history from fragments and gaps. The Necrons present a different problem entirely. They fought the Krork directly. They would have encountered the Brain Boyz in battlefield contexts, analyzed them as threats, developed countermeasures against their innovations. The Necrons are nothing if not thorough in their strategic documentation. Their engram-stored memories should contain perfect records of every encounter, every analysis, every data point about the Brain Boyz' capabilities and weaknesses. And yet when Necrons awaken in the 41st millennium and encounter the degraded Orks we know today, they express confusion, disappointment. They remember the Krork as worthy opponents, massive and intelligent and terrifying in their coordination and tactical acumen. The modern Orks are a pale shadow, and the Necrons recognize this, but do they mention the Brain Boyz? The sources are maddeningly silent on this point. Either the Necrons also lost or corrupted this information during their millions of years of sleep, or they're choosing not to share it, or the information exists but hasn't been relevant enough to any recorded encounter to be mentioned. Each possibility tells us something different about the Brain Boyz' erasure. If the Necrons lost the data, it suggests that even the most advanced information storage systems decay given enough time, that no record is truly permanent, no knowledge truly secure. If they're choosing not to share, it suggests the information has strategic value, that knowing about the Brain Boyz might provide leverage or insight that the Necrons prefer to keep to themselves. If the information exists but hasn't been relevant, well, that might be the saddest option. It would mean the Brain Boyz are so thoroughly extinct, so completely irrelevant to current galactic affairs, that even a race with perfect memory sees no reason to bring them up. Imagine being so erased that beings who could tell your story choose not to because there's simply no point. Your existence becomes a historical footnote so minor that even those who witnessed it directly don't think you're worth discussing. That's extinction beyond death. That's being unmade, not just physically, but narratively. The Brain Boyz achieved a form of anti-immortality. They're not just forgotten, they're aggressively irrelevant. Their absence so complete that even acknowledging it seems like wasted effort. And yet here we are, acknowledging them, trying to reconstruct their story from negative space and inference. Why? What drives this archaeological impulse to recover the irrecoverable, to remember beings who perhaps were designed not to be remembered? I think it's because the Brain Boyz represent something that resonates with modern anxieties about technology, creation, and control. We live in an age where we're designing artificial intelligences, manipulating genetics, creating tools that might outlive and outsmart us. The Brain Boyz' fate is a cautionary tale, but not in the simple sense of, don't play God. It's more subtle than that. The Brain Boyz didn't fail because they lacked intelligence or foresight or capability. They failed, if we can even call it failure, because they succeeded too well. They created something that worked exactly as intended, and then discovered that exactly as intended included their own obsolescence. They gave the Orks everything they needed to survive and thrive in the post-war in heaven galaxy, and in doing so, gave them everything they needed to survive without their creators. The tragedy isn't that the Brain Boyz made mistakes, it's that they made no mistakes, and perfection itself became their doom. This connects to deeper philosophical questions about the relationship between creators and creations. Do parents have the right to expect their children's loyalty? Do artists have the right to expect their art will remember them? Do engineers have the right to expect the machines they build will honor their memory? The obvious answer is no, or at least not in any enforceable sense. Children grow up and develop their own lives. Art takes on meanings its creator never intended. Machines simply function according to their programming, indifferent to sentiment or history. The Brain Boyz were parents, artists, and engineers all at once. They birthed a species, designed a masterpiece, built a perfect machine. And that triple achievement earned them triple abandonment. But perhaps abandonment is the wrong word. Perhaps what happened to the Brain Boyz was closer to transcendence. Not in the positive spiritual sense, but in the technical sense of being superseded, moved beyond, rendered unnecessary by the very processes they set in motion. They didn't fail. They completed their function so thoroughly that the function itself dissolved, leaving nothing for them to do or be. They were scaffolding that shaped the building and then was removed because the building could stand on its own. Except, buildings don't typically erase the memory of their scaffolding. Buildings don't develop psychic fields that make the concept of scaffolding literally unthinkable. This brings us back to the Orks themselves, to the question of whether they know at some deep unconscious level what they are and where they came from. There's a theory, mostly speculation but intriguing nonetheless, that Ork technology works not because the Orks believe it works, but because it was designed to work in ways that appear to be belief dependent. That is, the Brain Boyz created technology that functions through mechanisms we don't understand, mechanisms that might involve quantum effects or warp interactions too subtle for our instruments to detect. And then they engineered the Orks to have cultural expectations that align with how that technology actually functions. So when an Ork believes a red vehicle goes faster, he's not making it go faster through psychic power. He's simply activating design features built into the vehicle that respond to his neurological state, which the Brain Boyz programmed to associate red with high-performance configurations. If this theory is true, and I emphasize if, because we're in the realm of pure speculation here, then the Orks technology is even more sophisticated than we give it credit for. It's not crude machinery held together by belief. It's advanced machinery designed to interface with belief, to use the Gestalt field as a control mechanism rather than a reality-warping force. This would be consistent with what we know about the Brain Boyz' capabilities. They were genetic engineers primarily, but genetic engineers working at a level where the line between biology and technology, between organism and machine, becomes meaningless. They could have built psychic technological interfaces into the Ork DNA. Systems that activate in response to collective mental states and produce effects that look magical, but are actually applied science beyond our current understanding. And if this is true, then the Orks don't just carry the Brain Boyz' genetic legacy, they carry their technological legacy, encrypted into every cell, every instinct, every seemingly irrational behavior. When an Ork mech slaps together a shooter from scrap metal and prayer, he's not creating from nothing. He's reconstructing, following patterns embedded in his genes, activating systems that have been waiting in dormancy for him to need them. The Brain Boyz are still there, in a sense, still teaching, still guiding, still shaping Orkoid development across millions of years. They achieved a kind of immortality after all, not as individuals, not even as a species, but as information encoded so deeply into their creation that it's become indistinguishable from nature itself. This is the seventh paradox, and perhaps the final one. The Brain Boyz are completely extinct, and yet completely present. They're gone from physical reality, but embedded in genetic reality. They cannot be remembered, but cannot be escaped. Their absence is their presence. Their death is their legacy. They lost everything and won everything simultaneously. And we, trying to understand them from 60 million years distant, find ourselves trapped in the same contradiction. We cannot know them. But we cannot stop trying to know them, because they represent something fundamental about the nature of creation and loss, about what it means to make something that outlives you, about the price of success when success means your own erasure. The Orks don't mourn the Brain Boyz. They can't mourn what they can't remember. But perhaps, in some strange way, their entire existence is a form of mourning, a living monument to beings who gave them everything and asked for nothing in return, or at least asked for nothing they were capable of giving. Every WAAAGH that sweeps across the galaxy, every crude vehicle that shouldn't work but does, every victory against impossible odds. These are the Brain Boyz' legacy made manifest, not in statues or songs or historical records, but in biological persistence, in evolutionary success. In the simple, undeniable fact that 60 million years after their creators vanished, the Orks are still here, still fighting, still spreading through the galaxy like the universe's most successful fungal infection. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all the Brain Boyz wanted or could have hoped for, to create something that endured. To solve the problem they were given, design a weapon that can win the war in heaven, so completely that nothing more needed to be done. They could have designed the Orks to need them, to remain dependent on Brain Boyz' oversight and guidance. They didn't. They designed for independence, for resilience, for survival under any conditions. And the Orks repaid that gift by surviving, by thriving, by becoming one of the galaxy's dominant forces despite, or because of, their apparent simplicity. The silence that remains, then, is not empty. It's full of everything the Brain Boyz put into their creations, and nothing of the Brain Boyz themselves. It's a silence that screams with the absence of acknowledgement, with the weight of unremembered sacrifice, with the echo of intelligence applied so perfectly that it erased the intelligent. And as we approach our final chapter, as we prepare to draw what conclusions we can from this investigation into absence, we need to sit with that silence for a moment. We need to feel its weight. Because the Brain Boyz aren't just a historical mystery or a lore curiosity. They're a mirror that reflects our own anxieties about legacy, about meaning, about whether anything we create or accomplish will outlive us in any meaningful way. The answer, if the Brain Boyz can teach us anything, is both yes and no. Yes, your work can outlive you. No, it won't remember you. Yes, you can achieve perfection. No, perfection won't save you. Yes, you can create something greater than yourself. No, that greatness won't redeem your absence. These are hard truths, uncomfortable truths, truths that resist the narrative satisfaction we usually expect from stories about creation and legacy. But they're the truths we find when we dig into the deep lore, when we excavate the layers of forgotten history, when we ask questions about beings who cannot answer because they've been erased so thoroughly that even asking feels futile, and yet we ask anyway. Because that's what conscious beings do. We question, we investigate. We try to recover meaning from meaninglessness, pattern from chaos, story from silence. The Brain Boyz would understand that impulse, I think. They were scientists, after all. They knew about observation and inference, about reconstructing wholes from fragments, about the beautiful futility of trying to understand systems that remain forever beyond complete comprehension. They lived that futility, they embodied it, and then they vanished into it, leaving us to wonder whether their story has any conclusion beyond the simple, stark fact of their absence. But there's one more angle we need to explore, one more question that demands our attention before we can lay this investigation to rest. Not what happened to the Brain Boyz, but what their disappearance means for the current galaxy, for the future of the Orks, for the patterns of creation and destruction that govern all intelligent life in the 40K universe. Their absence isn't just historical, it's operational. It shapes the present even as it obscures the past. And understanding that influence, that ghostly presence through absence, might be the closest we can come to truly knowing the Brain Boyz in all their tragic, brilliant, extinct glory. Chapter 4. The Ghost in the Gene. We've spent 3 chapters excavating absence, interrogating theories, confronting paradoxes. We've tried to understand beings who cannot be understood, because they've been erased so thoroughly that even their erasure feels suspect, too complete to be natural. But now we must ask the question that gives all this archaeological effort its urgency. So what? What does it matter that the Brain Boyz existed and then stopped existing? What does? Their disappearance mean for the galaxy we actually inhabit, the one filled with degraded Orks and scrambling Necrons, and the Imperium's desperate struggle against entropy? Why should we care about extinct engineers when the weapons they built are still very much operational and causing problems across a million worlds? The answer lies in understanding that extinction is never complete. Not really, not when we're talking about beings who manipulated genetics at fundamental levels, who encoded information into living systems designed to persist across geological timescales. The Brain Boyz are dead, yes. Gone, yes. Unmemorable, yes. But their fingerprints are all over the Orkoid genome, and those fingerprints contain implications we're only beginning to understand. Every Ork that spawns from a spore carries Brain Boyz DNA sequences. Every mech boy who builds a vehicle without understanding engineering carries Brain Boyz knowledge. Every war boss who leads a WAAGH without formal military training carries Brain Boyz tactical doctrine. They're ghosts in the genetic machine, present in their absence, influential through their invisibility, and this ghostly presence has consequences. Real, measurable, dangerous consequences that shape current events in ways most inhabitants of the 40K universe don't recognize. Let me give you a concrete example, the phenomenon of increasingly sophisticated Ork technology appearing in sectors where Orkoid populations reach critical mass. The Imperium notices this, catalogues it, tries to develop countermeasures, but they don't understand why it happens. They attribute it to orcish cunning or random evolutionary luck. But what if it's neither? What if it's the Brain Boyz' genetic programming activating in response to population thresholds? Consider the design challenge they faced. Create a weapon species that can scale from small raiding parties to galaxy-spanning empires without losing effectiveness. How do you do that? You can't rely on centralized leadership because that creates single points of failure. You can't rely on written knowledge because that can be destroyed. You can't rely on teaching because that requires teachers who might not survive long enough to pass on critical information, so you encode it. You build triggers into the DNA that activate when specific conditions are met. When the population reaches X threshold, genes activate that enable Y level of technological sophistication. When resources reach A abundance, genes activate that enable B level of strategic coordination. This would explain so much about Orkoid behavior that currently seems random or inexplicable. It would explain why orcs in small groups are relatively easy to defeat, but orcs in massive WAA age become existential threats capable of challenging entire sectors. It's not just numbers, it's qualitative transformation triggered by quantitative thresholds. The Brain Boyz didn't create a static weapon. They created a dynamic, self-scaling weapon that adapts its capabilities to match the scale of the challenge it faces. At low populations, orcs are manageable threats. At high populations, they become the terror that kept Necrons awake at night during the War in Heaven. But here's where it gets really interesting and really disturbing. If this scaling system exists, encoded in Orkoid genetics by the Brain Boyz millions of years ago, then it might have thresholds we haven't seen yet. Population levels or resource concentrations that would trigger even more sophisticated capabilities, bring the orcs closer to their Krork ancestors, activate genetic potential that's been dormant since the War in Heaven ended, and massive Orkoid populations dispersed into smaller warbands. What if the galaxy's current orc infestation, scattered and divided as it is, represents only a fraction of what the species is capable of? What if the Brain Boyz designed the orcs to get scarier the more you kill them, because dead orcs release spores that grow more, orcs that trigger population thresholds that activate more advanced genetics? This is the 8th paradox, the operational one that transforms the Brain Boyz from historical curiosity into present threat. They're extinct, but they're still designing, still iterating, still responding to battlefield conditions through the medium of encoded genetic responses. They created a weapon that doesn't need them to operate, and that independence means the weapon continues operating according to specifications set millions of years ago, specifications that might not account for current galactic conditions, specifications that could produce catastrophic results if the wrong thresholds get crossed. The Imperium doesn't know this. They can't know this because they don't know the Brain Boyz existed. So they fight orcs with strategies that assume the greenskins are a relatively static threat, numerous and dangerous, yes, but fundamentally unchanging. They don't realize they might be triggering evolutionary responses with every campaign, that culling orc populations might paradoxically select for more sophisticated variants, that the war against the greenskins might be slowly breeding them back toward their Krork origins. The Brain Boyz engineered a species that gets better through combat, stronger through warfare, smarter through conflict. And the Imperium, in its desperate need to fight orcs wherever they appear, might be providing exactly the selective pressure required to activate dormant genetic programming. This is a nightmare scenario, not dramatic. There won't be some sudden day when all orcs transform into Krork and overwhelm the galaxy, but gradual, incremental. Each generation slightly more effective than the last, each WAAAGH slightly more coordinated, each mech boy slightly more innovative. The Brain Boyz designed for persistence, and persistence means gradual improvement in response to environmental challenges. The orcs are being shaped by their environment, shaped back toward what they once were, what the Brain Boyz originally designed them to be. And nobody except perhaps the Necrons realizes it's happening. Let me give you another example, more speculative, but grounded in the lore we have, the potential for orc psychers to evolve beyond their current limited scope. Right now, weird boys are dangerous but relatively simple. They channel the Gestalt field's energy, sometimes explosively. But what if that's just the first stage of a developmental sequence? What if Brain Boyz' genetic programming includes instructions for more sophisticated psychic abilities that activate when certain conditions are met? During the War in Heaven, the warp was less corrupted, less dangerous. Psychic powers were tools rather than existential hazards. The Krork might have had psykers who could manipulate reality with precision rather than the crude, violent releases we see from Weird Boys. That potential might still exist in Ork DNA, waiting for the right trigger. And given that the modern galaxy is drowning in warp energy, given that psychic phenomena are becoming more common and more powerful across all species, the Orks might be approaching a threshold where their psychic capabilities undergo rapid evolution. The Gestalt field, which currently makes their technology work and occasionally produces explosive Weird Boy catastrophes, could become something far more dangerous. A coordinated psychic weapon capable of reshaping reality on larger scales, with more precision, according to specifications the Brain Boyz encoded when the warp was a very different kind of threat. The Imperium can't prepare for this because they don't understand the threat's nature. They see Orks as brute force problems requiring brute force solutions. They don't see the sophisticated genetic programming lurking beneath the crude exterior, the evolutionary potential waiting to activate, the ghost of the Brain Boy still whispering. Instructions through DNA sequences that have remained stable across 60 million years. And this blindness, this fundamental misunderstanding of what the Orks actually are, makes every Imperial victory potentially Pyrrhic. You can't win a war when you don't understand your enemy's true capabilities or the mechanisms by which those capabilities evolve. Now consider the Necrons' perspective. They fought the Krork. They know what the Orks used to be capable of, and when they wake up in the 41st millennium and encounter these degraded versions, they must be simultaneously relieved and disturbed. Relieved that the Krork have declined so far from their War in Heaven peak. Disturbed by the recognition that the fundamental genetic architecture remains intact, that the potential for reversion exists. Do the Necrons actively try to prevent Ork populations from reaching thresholds that might trigger more advanced genetics? Is that why they sometimes pursue extermination campaigns that seem excessive even by Necron standards? Are they trying to prevent a repeat of the War in Heaven by keeping Ork numbers below whatever critical mass might resurrect the Krork? If so, they're fighting a losing battle. Orks reproduce too quickly, spread too efficiently, thrive in too many environments. The Brain Boyz designed them to be unkillable as a species, and that design remains sound. You can exterminate individual Orks, you can cleanse entire planets, but you cannot eliminate the spores completely, cannot prevent reinfection, cannot stop the slow accumulation toward critical thresholds. The Necrons know this. They fought this battle once before and barely survived. Now they're waking to discover the battle never really ended. It just went into slow motion, spreading across 60 million years instead of concentrating into a few thousand years of intense warfare. And the Eldar? What do they see when they look at the Orks? Do they recognize the Brain Boyz' work? Do they understand the genetic programming, the evolutionary potential, the danger of complacency when dealing with a species engineered by beings who understood biology at levels the Eldar themselves might not match? The sources suggest the Eldar view Orks as irritating primitives, dangerous in large numbers, but ultimately beneath contempt compared to more sophisticated threats. This might be the most catastrophic misunderstanding in the galaxy. The Eldar have sophisticated psychic abilities, can see possible futures, navigate probability spaces that would drive human minds insane. But they're looking at the Orks as they are, not as they were or could become. They're missing the ghost in the genome, the dormant capabilities, the evolutionary trajectory that points back toward the Krork. Or maybe they're not missing it. Maybe they see it perfectly clearly and have chosen not to act because acting would reveal knowledge they prefer to keep hidden. The Eldar are manipulators, after all. They work through misdirection and strategic omission. If they understand that the Orks carry dormant Krork genetics, they might be deliberately allowing other races to trigger those genetics through warfare, creating crises that the Eldar can exploit for their own purposes. Use the Imperium and Necrons and Orks to exhaust each other, while the Eldar pursue their own schemes in the shadows. It's the kind of long-term, multi-layered strategy they excel at. And it's also the kind of strategy that tends to blow up catastrophically when you miscalculate even slightly. Because here's the thing about the Brain Boyz genetic programming. It was designed by beings who don't exist anymore, operating in a galaxy that doesn't exist anymore, responding to threats that don't exist anymore. The War in Heaven is over. The strategic situation has changed completely. The C'tan are sharded, the Necrons are sleeping, the Old Ones are gone. The Eldar have fallen. Chaos has emerged as a dominant force. And the Orks, those perfect weapons designed for a specific set of historical circumstances, continue operating according to specifications that might be wildly inappropriate for current conditions. What happens when a sophisticated weapon system encounters a situation its designers didn't account for? What happens when the Orks' genetic programming, responding to population thresholds and resource abundance, triggers capabilities meant for fighting Necrons, but now deployed against completely different enemies? The Brain Boyz couldn't predict the current state of the galaxy. They couldn't encode responses to threats that didn't exist during the War in Heaven, so the Orks might be evolving toward a configuration that made perfect sense 60 million years ago, but could be catastrophically destabilizing now. This is the ninth paradox, the one that should terrify everyone. The Brain Boyz were brilliant, but their brilliance was applied to solving problems that no longer exist. Their weapon is still deployed, still evolving, still responding to a strategic context that has vanished. It's like finding a loaded gun designed to fire when certain conditions are met, except you don't know what those conditions are. You don't know what the gun will do when it fires, and you can't unload it because the mechanism is encoded in living tissue spread across millions of worlds. The Brain Boyz created a doomsday device that reproduces itself, adapts to local conditions, and operates according to parameters we cannot fully understand or control, and we're all living in the blast radius. But let me pull back from the apocalyptic scenarios for a moment and consider a different angle. What if the Brain Boyz knew this would happen? What if they recognized that their weapon would outlive the war it was designed for, that it would continue operating in contexts they couldn't predict, that it would become a permanent feature of galactic ecology rather than a temporary military asset? And what if they built in safeguards, not to prevent the Orks from evolving back toward Krork capabilities, but to ensure that evolution happened gradually, controllably, in ways that wouldn't destabilize the post-war galaxy too catastrophically? This would require incredible foresight. More than foresight, it would require accepting that they themselves wouldn't survive to manage their creation, that they needed to build autonomous systems capable of making strategic decisions across millions of years without supervision. Could the Brain Boyz have achieved this? Could they have created genetic programming sophisticated enough to assess galactic conditions and modulate Orkoid evolution accordingly? It seems like science fiction even by Warhammer standards, but then so does everything the Brain Boyz apparently accomplished. If they could design a species whose collective belief warps reality, they could presumably design evolutionary governors that slow or accelerate development based on environmental feedback. What would such governors look like? They might manifest as limits on how quickly Orkoid populations can grow, ensuring they never concentrate too densely too quickly. They might manifest as internal conflicts, the endless fighting between warbands that prevents unified coordination except under exceptional circumstances. They might manifest as the Orks' apparent lack of long-term planning, the way they fragment after successful WIT-AAGH instead of consolidating gains and building empires. All of these behaviors could be engineered rather than emergent, designed to keep the Orks dangerous but not existential, threatening but not overwhelming. If this is true, and again we're deep in speculation here, then the Brain Boyz' ghost isn't just haunting the Orkoid genome. It's actively managing galactic stability through mechanisms so subtle that none of the current races recognize them as deliberate. The Orks aren't just weapons left running on automatic, they're a managed system, a strategic asset that continues serving its original purpose, even though that purpose has been forgotten by everyone except the long-dead engineers who encoded it into living flesh. This would make the Brain Boyz the most successful designers in galactic history, not because their creation survived them, but because it continues operating according to their strategic vision across unimaginable spans of time. But there's a darker interpretation available. Maybe the safeguards aren't safeguards at all. Maybe they're the opposite. Maybe the Brain Boyz programmed the Orks to eventually revert to full Krork capabilities, to grow back into the terror that the Necrons feared during the War in Heaven, to become an existential threat that forces the younger races to unite or perish. Why would they do this? Because they were designed by the Old Ones, who apparently believed in using biological weapons to solve their problems. The Old Ones lost the War in Heaven, but their weapons persist. What if those weapons were programmed with instructions to activate after a delay, to give the Necrons time to go into stasis, to give the galaxy time to forget what the Krork were capable of, and then to resurge at a moment when nobody remembers how to fight them effectively? This would make the Brain Boyz' disappearance not tragic, but strategic. They weren't erased by obsolescence or psychic catastrophe or Old Ones Betrayal. They erased themselves, deliberately, because their continued existence would have given the game away. If the Brain Boyz had survived visibly, the Necrons would have targeted them. The other races would have studied them. Someone would have figured out the long-term plan and developed countermeasures. But by vanishing completely, by becoming literally unthinkable to their creations, the Brain Boyz ensured that nobody would be looking for the time bomb they planted. The Orks appear simple, degraded, manageable. And by the time that appearance is revealed as camouflage for something far more dangerous, it'll be too late to stop it. I don't know if this interpretation is correct. I don't know if any of our interpretations are correct. The evidence is too fragmentary, the source is too contradictory, the time depth too vast for certainty. But that's the point, isn't it? The Brain Boyz have succeeded in being unknowable. Whether through deliberate choice or inevitable circumstance, they've become beings about whom we can only theorize, never truly know. And that unknowability is itself a form of victory, not the victory they might have wanted, but perhaps the only victory available to tools who recognized they were tools and decided to shape their own ending rather than passively accepting whatever fate their creators have planned. So where does this leave us? We've investigated theories of disappearance. We've examined the silence their absence created. We've explored the implications of their lingering influence through genetic programming. We've confronted paradoxes and ironies and philosophical questions that resist simple resolution, and we've arrived at no definitive answers because definitive answers aren't available. The Brain Boyz remain what they've always been in the lore: shadows, hints, theoretical necessities rather than concrete presences. They exist in a negative space between what we know about the Orks and what we know about the War in Heaven, an X marking a gap where something must have been, but nothing remains. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries don't need solutions. Maybe the value in investigating the Brain Boyz isn't in discovering the truth about what happened to them, because we never will, but in what the investigation reveals about how we think about creation, legacy, mortality, and meaning. The Brain Boyz created something that outlived them by 60 million years and will likely outlive them by many million more. They achieved a kind of immortality that transcends individual survival, but they paid for it with their own erasure, with forgetting so complete that even their existence becomes questionable. Is that a fair trade? Would you accept immortality through your work if it meant your work would never acknowledge you, never remember you, never know that you existed? The Brain Boyz didn't have a choice, or if they did, they made it so long ago that we can never recover their reasoning. But we have a choice every day about what we create and why we create it. About whether we build for recognition or impact, for credit or effectiveness, for ourselves or for something larger than ourselves. The Brain Boyz chose effectiveness, chose impact, chose something larger than themselves. And the galaxy repaid that choice with absolute indifference to their memory. That's not a happy ending. It's not even a satisfying ending. It's just an ending, or more accurately, it's not an ending at all, just a dissolving of one form into another. The Brain Boyz stopped being people and became code, stopped being entities and became patterns, stopped being present and became absent, yet influential. They're gone, but they're here, dead but alive, forgotten but embedded. And those contradictions, those paradoxes we've been circling throughout this entire investigation, might be the truest thing we can say about them. They exist in contradiction. They are contradiction. And trying to resolve that contradiction into a neat narrative with proper closure is a category error, an attempt to impose structure on something that resists structure by its very nature. So I'm not going to give you closure. I'm not going to pretend we've solved the mystery of the Brain Boyz' disappearance or arrived at definitive answers about their fate. We've done something different. We've sat with the ambiguity, explored its contours, traced the ways that absence shapes presence and invisibility creates influence. We've recognized that not all stories have endings, that not all questions have answers, that sometimes the most important investigations are the ones that don't resolve into satisfying conclusions, because reality itself doesn't provide such resolutions. The Brain Boyz are gone, the Orks remain, and the galaxy continues its slow grind toward entropy, occasionally punctuated by moments of brutal clarity when the Orks remind everyone why the Old Ones considered them necessary. That's all we know. That's all we can know. And perhaps, in the end, that's enough. Not satisfying, but enough. The Brain Boyz didn't need our understanding or our recognition or our memorial essays. They needed to create effective weapons, and they did. Mission accomplished. End of story. Except it's not the end, is it? Because 60 million years from now, the Orks will still be here, still fighting. Still carrying the Brain Boyz' genetic legacy forward into futures we cannot imagine. Still proving that their creators, however forgotten, however erased, however completely unmade from history and memory, succeeded in leaving a mark on the universe that no amount of time or entropy or forgetting can completely eliminate. They're dust. Their work is eternal. And that contradiction, that final irresolvable paradox, is perhaps the most Brain Boy-like thing about their entire existence. They were smart enough to see it coming,